Assalamualaikum, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I'd like to thank the Honorable Rector of NUST to have received me this morning. And we had a brief discussion, and I feel very honored that a great institution like NUST, a very young one, an institution that's contributing a lot to Pakistan and its economy and to the academia of this country, for NUST having hosted me this morning. I always have been a great supporter of the relationship that policy-making bodies need to have with the academia. When I was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the National Assembly back in 2014, I was able to institutionalize the relationship between a team of faculty members and the students of NUST with the Foreign Relations Committee, and we authored many papers. We did a lot of research, and NUST at that time, this team was headed by Dr. Rifat. He also contributed, he and the students and other faculty members contributed a lot to our foreign policy interventions that the parliamentary committee made to the Foreign Office at that point in time. We had held public hearings and we authored many papers and did a lot of study on the key foreign policy challenges that Pakistan faced at that point in time. So I wanted to also formalize, and I requested the Honorable Rector this morning to try to see how we could formalize the relationship between the policy-making arm of the PART division. We are making a new company. We have already, it exists, but we are trying to bring in a lot of good HR where that company, which will be the technical arm of the PART division, could partner with institutes like yourselves and help us make the right kind of policy interventions based on research, proper analysis, using the most modern analytical tools for all the data that exists in the power sector, because the power sector is basically all calculations. It's all about financial modeling, what kind of an intervention will do what kind of generation, transmission and distribution challenges need to be addressed, how, what would the numbers ultimately come up to be, what the demand needs to be, what the supply would be, how the economy will grow, what kind of an elasticity will that have vis-a-vis the growth of the overall economy itself, interest rates, everything else, new technologies, climate, the effects on climate change that our profile of our portfolio of energy in the future would have. So I would like the relationship to be formalized with NUST, and I hope we can actually materialize that under the leadership of the Rector himself and us at the PART division. So I was a part of this great debate the day before yesterday, and it all seemed as if the whole country is just obsessed about IPPs alone, and it's not IPPs alone. IPPs are a part of the generation portfolio of this country. There's a lot more to the power sector. And unless we embark upon reforms that we need to actually materialize and implement, and we don't have space anymore to falter or delay. Pakistan has, in my humble opinion, been one of the most irresponsible power sector governments or whatever we've had in the past. We haven't been very responsible. We've always been marred by desperation of trying to get over these problems of power supply shortages in the past. We haven't ever planned efficiently enough in the past to be able to give our country the right kind of an energy mix and at the right cost. And then there has been a complete political economy that has existed around the distribution system, around the transmission system. We We've had serious constraints in the past. We've been obsessed with a particular kind of energy. Everybody thinks hydro energy is the most cost efficient that could be. There are some perceptions that exist amongst the policymakers, in the media, and in the general public that are creating serious issues and problems. I'll just give you the example of solar net metering. We think solar net metering at the existing rates that are being offered to people who can afford to put in these solar net meters, we think this is the most efficient way to go about it. It's costing the rest of the consumers close to 100 billion rupees a year. So we're actually subsidizing and further giving a windfall profit to the rich elite of this country, who are just 115,000 in numbers. And this is going to swell in the next few years. Pakistan is expected to add on more than 1,200 megawatts of solar net metering every year. If we continue at the same rate and we give them the same rate of return, which is 18 to 20 months for their investment, Pakistan's power sector will seriously suffer. The rest of the pool will be added on, there'll be a burden of over 40 billion this year, 85 billion next year, and 160 billion the year after that on the rest of the consumers of this country, trying to give them a better rate of return on the investment that they make. They should make a good return, but that rate of return should be, and the payback period should not be more than 4 to 5 years. So these are perceptions in the country that exist, that are usually propagated by vested interests, that ensure that the policymakers don't have the courage to make such bold and effective decisions. And this is exactly what we are going to fight against. And this power division will, inshallah, in the near future, you'll see us make very serious corrections in the fault lines that exist in the power sector. So let me go back and, how much time? What is the time? It's 11. So I'll try to speak for the next 15 minutes, Dr. Saab, if you allow. And then I could take questions. And I do apologize for not being able to stay with you until 1:30, where I could have heard other speakers, but I'll make sure that we get a report of whatever is spoken about in this particular conference, and so that we can put that in as policy making advice for us. So basically we have the transmission system, the distribution system, and the generation part of the power sector. The generation part has not been, we haven't added generation in a healthy manner in the past, as I said. So in the past, whatever has been added onto the profile of the power sector as generation has not been on a least cost methodology. Whatever we have committed for the future, those investments have been made by the private sector and the public sector. It has not been on a least cost methodology. So out of the 17,000 megawatts that are going to be added on until 2034, only 87 megawatts is on a least cost methodology. Who's at fault? We are. Who's going to correct it? We will try to do it. So IGSEP, which is the basic planning of how power needs to be added on, where it needs to be added on, what technology needs to be added on in terms of our portfolio, this has been done in other than the least cost methodology basis. So SIN says, I want X amount of wind to be invested into. KPK says, I want X amount of hydro to be added into. We say we want coal or RLNG or whatever else. We've got transmission constraints because of which we have to make inefficient decisions. But our policy making and our policy making interventions on the generation side need a serious reboot. And that's what we are doing. We're looking at the least cost violations that projects like Bhasha would have to pay for through PSDP, and that part of the burden cannot be put on to the consumer for them to be able to finance that through the tariff, which has already become so unaffordable. So if Bhasha needs to come onto the system, then out of the so-called 7 billion or 6 billion US dollars worth of a cost, not more than 2 billion can be put on to the consumers. The rest of the cost has to be taken by the public sector development program. So the evacuation cost of Bhasha, if it's going to cost us $3 billion to put in the transmission system alone, just because Bhasha is a hydel project doesn't make sense. Bhasha, yes, as a water storage project makes sense. Pakistan much requires that. Climate change issues much require that we invest into Bhasha. But the electricity part of Bhasha has to be, the burden has to be taken over by PSDP, or we don't put in electricity generators. And the electric consumer should not be burdened with Bhasha. Because when Bhasha comes in, at the cost at which it is, if the entire burden is put on you consumers, it will break the backbone of whatever is left of our power sector and the tariff structure itself. Even other projects. Do we need a 300 megawatt imported coal power plant in Gwadar? Does it make sense? No. So there are serious corrections that we are going to the federal cabinet with in the near future after having made all these assessments. And we are making these assessments in a very realistic and practical and pragmatic manner. So this is the generation part of it. IPPs I'm very grateful to the IPPs for being kind enough and understanding enough to cooperate with us to try to revise the contract conditions that they have been working on in the past many years. Upfront tariffs, cost plus tariffs in the past, not acceptable anymore. I strongly believe that the government of Pakistan should not be the single purchaser of power in the future. Power needs to be generated and bought by the private sector amongst themselves. There needs to be an exchange of power, the CTBCM, competitive markets that we want to introduce, that we've been wanting to do for the past 25 years now as a country and have not been able to do so. I'd like to congratulate Pakistan that this afternoon, the Cabinet Committee on Energy would be hopefully approving the formation of the first independent system market operator that would then enable these transactions to start happening over the next 6 to 12 months, inshallah. And that will be a very big breakthrough. वो CPPA, वो government का खरीदना IPPs या government से वो ख़त्म ही हो जाएगा system. So everybody will buy and everybody will produce and everybody will buy whatever energy they require in the future at the best terms and conditions, and that's where competition will kick in. Competition will bring down the prices of power in the future. CPPA can't do that. The government of Pakistan is not supposed to be doing that. We cannot do that. So we'll create an environment where market operations on the power generation side and the buying side would start. The other very important part of reforms is the distribution companies. We have to put a stop to the political economy that is revolving around distribution companies. 595 billion rupees are budgeted every year just for the loss of distribution companies for distribution companies of the loss in recovery and power theft that they do. Unbelievable, unacceptable, it's not sustainable. We would have had 600 billion rupees extra to fund institutions like NUST if the distribution companies were not to be making these losses. That's 600 billion rupees a year. That's serious money. So what's going to happen? Am I going to put the discourse in order? No, I can't. I'm going to put in place good professional board members in place, and those boards would be responsible. Who is the additional secretary or the joint secretary of my ministry or me? Have we ever been in the business of running distribution companies or utility companies? No. It's not my job. It was not my job when I was a federal minister, and I was just, what, 32 years old. And I realized it then that PTCL needs to be privatized and the government should come out of the business of doing businesses. And we deregulated the sector at that time. PTCL was supposed to have been privatized back in the 1980s. We did it after 20 years. This is exactly what we'll have to do with the distribution companies. So they have to be privatized. So in the next 5 years, inshallah, by the end of next year, 3 distribution companies would have been privatized. 2 distribution companies, which give you a loss of over 150 billion rupees a year, would have been privatized through the concession agreement model. This is serious reform. Bringing in distribution companies, boards and board of members, एक सिफारिश भी नहीं ली पिछले 6 महीने में किसी एक्सीएन के ट्रांसफर की एससी के ट्रांसफर. Everybody on the political side is maybe unhappy with us. All the MNAs and the MPs, because they're not being provided proper customer care services by the existing XCNs and SCs. They're not to blame, so they want their own SC to be able to resolve the issues of the people. Our complaint systems don't work. 118 does not work. That will have to work. So the customer care is going to be, we are going to focus on that, and the discos will have to be privatized, and we are going to make sure that in the next 5 years, if we have the support of the whole of the government, people are shy of saying and admitting. And they keep asking us these snide questions as to why is the army involved in this, and why is the establishment and the security establishment helping you with this and that. Why should not they help us? If they have a position of strength, they're doing it for the country. We are doing it as a country as a whole of the government approach is being used as part of the task forces that we formed in Islamabad today. So we are all proud of the fact that everybody is contributing to this cause, and we are coming up with good, practical, logic-based, realistic kind of the solutions that will not hurt the private sector and the business environment of this country in the future. So that's the distribution part of it. The transmission, we've had serious transmission constraints. You have cheap power in the south that cannot be transmitted to the north, to the load centers. There were coal plants that were much cheaper to run, and we have been wasting over 30 billion rupees a month for not being able to dispatch the power being produced by cheaper plants up to the load centers. Our entire planning was wonky. Why? Because NTDC's board was not working. We just put in a board where a very senior advisor at LUMS is now chairing the board of NTDC, and we brought in proper professionals, sectoral experts into this board, and they've given us a whole new idea and the way to work around the transmission system. The National Transmission Company, in the next 2 or 3 days after cabinet approval, we've worked everything out. The Prime Minister has given permission. Just the cabinet formality is left. So the National Transmission Company has been broken up into 3 different pieces, into 3 entities. One is going to be taking care of the future projects, a very slim, trim company of not more than 60 to 70 professionals who will conceive the projects, who will look at the constraints, who will come up with new projects, who will implement those through an outsourcing model and hand it over to the existing NTDC, which would be converted into a company called NGC Asset. And they'll be responsible for managing the entire transmission system of this country at the most cost-effective manner. Who's going to fund all these constraints? Right now, as we speak, I need more than $2.5 billion to remove the 4 most important constraints that the national transmission has. Rahim Yar Khan Matiari, Ghazi Barotha Faisalabad transmission line, reactive power, and the battery storage, which will ensure no curtailment of renewable energy that's happening in the south of this country. these 4 projects, we were begging people. We begged the Saudis, we begged everybody in this world to come and invest into those projects, and we were going to give them a very high rate of return on their equity. That wasn't the way to go about it. So we talked to our development partners like the Asian Development Bank, like the World Bank, like GIZ and others. When they sat down and looked at our power sector reform program threadbare, and when we looked at how, and when we proved to them that we are serious and that's all the work we are doing, Pakistan should be proud of the fact that last week I was able to secure this entire $2.5 billion over the next 2 years only. So everything will be spent in the next 2 years at concessional financing rates, which hardly cost the country anything. So there would be no new IPPs being created on the transmission side, and Pakistan would be able to do it in a much more sustainable and cost-effective manner. So that's what we're doing on the transmission side, but transmission needs a lot more. So these new transmission companies would actually evolve into entities that will have private sector equity opportunities also there to exist in the future, so that we get better management practices and more equity coming in from global players into the transmission system of Pakistan. So that's transmission, distribution, and the generation. The competitive market part of it is as important. I've talked about that. But the planning for the future, how your grid evolves into a smart grid. What about all this distributed power that is being added on to the grid? 1200 megawatts every year is a lot of power that the people are investing into at their own cost and risk. Is the grid smart enough to be able to accept all this injection of power in a distributed manner or not? Is the grid smart enough to realize that 4 years down the line, when battery storage becomes commercially viable, and when all of you would be producing solar power at home and would be storing it in a more cost-effective manner and releasing it back into the system at night, what happens to our base load plants? When will we start introducing the peaking plants concept, which is the more effective way to do it? So the transmission system itself needs to be very carefully looked at, and we are aware of the challenges that Pakistan faces now and would continue to do in the future. And we are trying to prepare ourselves with the best HR available and trying to plan it out well in advance, so that Pakistan is never desperate enough to add on power in an inefficient manner, to add on transmission in an inefficient manner, and to handle the distribution companies in an inefficient manner. So the last thing I'd like to talk about is the regulator. Serious issues. The capacity in our regulatory body, they're trying to do their best, whatever they can. Not enough. The regulator has to improve. This concept of having one member from each province is not good enough for us. The members representing the provinces would have to be sector experts. They have to have an education and a qualification criteria without which we must have the right to refuse any recommendations coming in from the provinces. This can't go on. There's a former retired civil servant or an engineer that doesn't know elbow from its head about the power sector cannot be accepted as a member of the regulatory authority. Should not be. So we are wanting to also advise the government to have a serious relook at how we can reform the regulatory body itself. And then we need to give enough independence to the regulator to be able to operate and not keep asking it to make certain decisions because it's strategically not acceptable to us. We can't do that. Either you go in for a least cost methodology and the most efficient systems across the power sector, or you don't. And then you pay for the and then you bear the consequences of what you and I are all bearing in the form of inexpensive and unreliable power supply in most parts of our economy.